The air in the pre-dawn was a specific kind of cold, the kind that carried the memory of stone and river water. It was a thinning darkness, not yet surrendering to the light, but losing its density, turning from black to a deep and bruised purple at the edges of the city's flat-roofed buildings. At this hour, the world was made of silence and suggestion. But inside the narrow brick building on 3rd Street, a different world was already being born, one of warmth and chemistry and exacting labor. Elias was not a baker. He was a man who baked. The distinction was a fortress he had built around himself, brick by painstaking brick, over the last 7 years. To be a baker was a title, a public identity, a story told to others. He had no interest in stories anymore. He was interested in the precise hydration of dough, the patient and stubborn life of yeast, the exact temperature at which a crust would achieve its deepest mahogany song when tapped. He was a man who performed a function, and the function gave him shelter. His movements were an economy of force, a discipline learned in a different life, and applied now to flour and water. He moved through the small, immaculate bakery like a current of air, silent and purposeful. The floorboards, scrubbed nightly until the wood grain showed like veins, did not creak beneath his worn leather boots. His hands, dusted with a fine layer of rye flour, worked without hesitation. They knew the feel of a perfectly developed gluten structure not by thought, but by a deeper cellular memory. The bakery was his monastery. The rhythmic thump of the dough against the cold marble slab was a prayer. The low hum of the convection ovens was a chant. The scent was the thing that anchored him most. It was a complex and layered perfume that changed with the hour. Now, at 4 a.m., it was the clean, mineral smell of raw flour, the sweet and tangy promise of the levain bubbling quietly in its crock, the faint, metallic scent of the copper pots hanging from their hooks. Later, it would become the nutty aroma of toasting seeds, the rich and almost chocolatey notes of dark rye, the simple, life-affirming smell of bread straight from the hearth. He wore a uniform of self-erasure, gray t-shirt, dark work pants, a canvas apron the color of dust. Nothing to be remarked upon, nothing to be remembered. He was the man behind the counter, the hands that made the bread. He was a background detail in the lives of his customers, and that was exactly how he wanted it. His true nature was concealed not by a costume, but by the utter sincerity of his humble role. He had once designed buildings that scraped the sky, structures of steel and glass that reshaped skylines. Now he built small, perishable monuments from grain, and found a more profound satisfaction in their brief, beautiful existence. There was one order that tested the limits of his craft, a standing order for a man he had never met. It was for a single loaf, to be picked up every morning at 9. A pane di Altamura, but a specific variation, one that required a starter fed with a blend of 3 different ancient grains and a double fermentation that spanned 36 hours. It was a technically demanding, almost temperamental bread. The crust had to be a full inch thick, a dark, cracked armor protecting a crumb so soft and yellow it was like solidified sunlight. It was not a profitable loaf to make. It took too much time, too much attention, too much space in his proofing cabinet. But it was a challenge of precision and consistency, and for that, Elias respected it. The order was for a Mr. Silvestri, a name that meant nothing and everything in this city. It was a name spoken in whispers in places Elias no longer frequented. The request had come not as a demand, but as a quiet, formal inquiry delivered by a man in a suit that cost more than the bakery's monthly rent. They had asked if it was possible. Elias, recognizing the deep, almost forgotten pleasure of a difficult problem, had said yes. For 2 years he had made the bread. For 2 years at 9 o'clock sharp, a quiet man in a dark car had come to collect it. It was a transaction of silent professionalism, a matter of craft, not commerce. It was a load-bearing wall in the fragile structure of his new life. And today, like every other day, the loaf was perfect. It sat cooling on the rack, a dark, rustic sphere that smelled of toasted wheat and time itself. The first hint of the sun, a pale, watery gold, was just beginning to touch the tops of the buildings across the street. Elias wiped down the marble slab with a damp cloth, the stone sighing as it released the last of the dough's warmth. He rolled down his sleeves, the fine white dust clinging to the dark hairs on his forearms. The bells on the door were silent. The world outside had not yet begun its clamor. In the quiet hum of the ovens and the fragrant warmth of the air, he felt a familiar, fragile sense of peace. It was the peace of a man who has successfully erased himself, who has buried his past so deep that even he can sometimes forget where the body lies. It was a peace he had paid a great price for, and he did not know that it was about to be shattered. The sun was climbing, the city was beginning to stir, and soon the world would come knocking. The chime of the bell above the door was a delicate three-note sound, a sound Elias himself had chosen. It was designed to be pleasant, unobtrusive, a gentle announcement rather than a jarring intrusion. At 7 o'clock it began to ring with a soft regularity as the first wave of customers arrived, drawn by the scent of coffee and fresh pastry that now billowed onto the sidewalk. These were the early risers, the office workers, the construction crews. They came for croissants flaky enough to shatter at a touch, for dense, sticky cinnamon rolls, for the dark, bracing coffee he brewed in small, potent batches. Elias moved behind the counter with the same fluid efficiency, his face a mask of polite neutrality. He was a service, not a person. He exchanged pleasantries that were as light and airy as his brioche, words that dissolved the moment they were spoken. At 8:15, the bell chimed for Mrs. Gable. She was as much a part of the bakery's morning ritual as the grinding of the coffee beans. A small, bird-like woman in her late 70s, with a cloud of white hair and eyes that held the quiet, resilient clarity of old glass. She had lived in the neighborhood for 50 years, had seen it rise and fall and begin to rise again. Her presence was a quiet anchor to a history that predated the trendy cafes and glass-fronted condos. She didn't just buy bread. She curated it, her selections changing with the seasons, her mood, the weather. Elias saw her through the large plate glass window before she entered, her steps careful on the uneven pavement. A small, genuine smile touched his lips, a crack in the carefully constructed facade. He had a soft spot for Mrs. Gable. She reminded him of his grandmother, of a world where kindness was a currency, and dignity was not dependent on strength. He had her order ready before she reached the counter. A small sourdough boule, still warm, and a single almond croissant, which he knew she would save for her afternoon tea. "Good morning, Elias," she said, her voice thin but clear, like a pressed flower. "The air smells particularly wonderful today." He inclined his head. "Mrs. Gable." He slid the paper-wrapped loaf and the pastry bag across the counter. "The almond has extra filling." Her smile was a reward. "You spoil me, young man." She fumbled in her worn leather purse, her fingers stiff with arthritis. It was a familiar, painful ritual. The struggle of age against the simple mechanics of daily life. Elias always looked away, a small act of respect, pretending to check the temperature on one of the ovens, giving her the space to complete the task without the pressure of his gaze. He heard the clink of coins on the counter. He turned back. Then the bell chimed again. It was not the gentle chime of a customer. It was a hard, discordant jangle, as if the door had been thrown open with force. The warm, fragrant air of the bakery was instantly diluted by a wave of cold from the street and the faint, cloying scent of cheap cologne. 2 men filled the doorway, their shoulders broad enough to block the morning light. They were not here for bread. Predators have a particular way of occupying space. It is not about size, but about intent. They drift, they circle, they absorb the energy of a room and replace it with a low-frequency hum of menace. These men were sharks in a fishbowl. They wore tracksuits and heavy gold chains, a uniform of crude ambition. Their eyes, small and dark, scanned the bakery not with appreciation, but with assessment, cataloging value, identifying weakness. One of them had a thin, jagged scar that pulled at the corner of his mouth, giving him a permanent sneer. The other was younger, his face still soft with a kind of brutish immaturity, but his eyes held the same vacant cruelty. Aaliyah's hands, which had been about to collect Mrs. Gable's coins, stilled. He felt a change in the room's pressure, a shift in its atmospheric weight. The low hum of the refrigerators suddenly seemed louder. The ticking of the wall clock became a metronome, marking the seconds of rising tension. He did not look at the men directly. He kept his eyes on Mrs. Gable. He saw her frail shoulders tense. Her hand, which had been reaching for her change, froze, then slowly retreated. The light in her eyes flickered and dimmed. She seemed to shrink, her vibrant presence from moments before folding in on itself like a frightened insect. The man with the scar sauntered toward the counter, his movements a lazy parody of confidence. He ignored Elias completely, his focus entirely on the small, elderly woman. "Morning, Agnes," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. The casual use of her first name was a violation, an assertion of unearned intimacy. "We was just talking about you, wondering how you were." Mrs. Gable did not answer. She stared at the wooden counter, at the scattered coins that seemed like a fallen constellation between them. Her breathing was shallow, a tiny puff of air in, a tinier puff out. The younger man drifted over to the pastry case, peering through the glass, his thick fingers leaving greasy smuts on the polished surface. He was not looking at the pastries. He was positioning himself, flanking her, cutting off a line of retreat that she had no intention of taking. The geometry of the threat was simple, brutal, and effective. Elias remained behind the counter. Still. He was a statue carved from flour and resolve. He could feel the familiar cold dread coiling in his stomach. A serpent he had kept starved for 7 years. It was the feeling he had fled, the feeling that had driven him into this quiet, orderly exile. The sight of the powerful preying on the weak. It was the foundational principle of the world he had left behind, the world of leveraged buyouts and hostile takeovers, of lives ruined on paper for the sake of a percentage point. He had thought, foolishly, that by shrinking his own world to the size of this small shop, he could escape it. But the world, in all its casual cruelty, had followed him. It had walked right through his door and was standing 3 feet away, breathing its stale breath on a good and decent woman. He could smell their fear on her, a sharp, metallic tang that cut through the sweet aroma of baking bread, and it was a smell he could no longer tolerate. The man with the scar leaned closer to Mrs. Gable, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried across the silent room. "That boy of yours, Agnes, he's late." Again, Mr. Rico is getting impatient. You know how he gets. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a reminder of a power structure she was already painfully aware of. Her son, a good man with a bad habit, had fallen into a trap, and the trap was now closing around his mother. It's been a slow week," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her gaze was fixed on the floor, on the patterns of flour dust that looked like a faded map of a forgotten country. "I'll have it. Next week, I promise." "Promises don't pay the interest," the man sneered. He reached out a hand, not to strike her, but to do something almost worse. He casually picked up the almond croissant from her bag on the counter. He sniffed it, then took a large, messy bite, crumbs spraying from his lips. He chewed with his mouth open, a grotesque display of dominance. "That's a nice pastry. Expensive, I bet. Funny how you got money for this, but not for your responsibilities." The act was so small, so petty, and so profoundly insulting that it broke the spell of the room's tension. It was a line being crossed. Not a line of violence, but of decency. Elias felt something shift inside him. A gear, long rusted, grinding into place. He had built this life on a foundation of non-intervention. Stay quiet. Stay invisible. Do the work. Survive. It was a code born of trauma and loss. But his father had taught him another code, a much older one. You do not stand by. You do not let the wolf into the sheepfold. His father, the architect, had believed that a structure's integrity was only as strong as its moral foundation. What is a man, he used to say, but a structure built of choices? Elias set the cloth he was holding down on the counter. The movement was deliberate, quiet, yet it drew every eye in the room. The younger thug by the pastry case looked up. The man with the scar paused his chewing, a crumb clinging to his lip. Even Mrs. Gable lifted her head, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a dawning, terrible hope. Elias looked at the man with the scar. His gaze was flat, devoid of emotion. It was the gaze of a man assessing a structural flaw. "Leave it," he said. His voice was not loud. It was calm, measured, and carried the weight of an ultimatum. Just 2 words. They hung in the air, heavier than any shout. The thug's eyes narrowed. He swallowed the half-chewed pastry. "What did you say, flower boy?" He mistook the quiet for weakness. "It was a common mistake. I said, leave it." Elias's hands were on the counter, palms down. His posture had not changed. He was still just a baker behind his counter. But something in his stillness had become formidable. The space around him seemed to contract, to densify. It was no longer a bakery. It was his territory. And they were trespassers. The thug chuckled, a low, ugly sound. He looked at his partner. "You hear this guy? He thinks he's somebody." He turned back to Elias, his face a mask of theatrical contempt. "Or what? You gonna hit me with a baguette?" He took a step closer, deliberately invading the personal space across the counter. The smell of his cologne was sickening. Elias didn't move. His eyes flickered down for a fraction of a second, to the floor just in front of the counter. It was a detail only he would know. A small bag of flour had torn earlier that morning, leaving a fine, almost invisible slick on the polished concrete. He had meant to clean it up. He was glad he hadn't. His gaze returned to the man's eyes. "I think you should leave," he repeated. His voice was even softer now, yet it held a new and dangerous edge. "This is your only warning." There was a moment of pure, suspended silence. The thug, the scar, the sneer. They were all part of a performance of intimidation he had played 100 times. But the script had suddenly changed. The audience was not reacting correctly. The baker was not afraid. He was waiting. The younger thug sensed it first. He shifted his weight, his bravado starting to curdle into unease. He had seen real danger before, and it rarely announced itself with shouting. It was often quiet, like this. The scarred man, however, was too committed to his role. His pride was on the line. He couldn't be seen backing down from a baker. He puffed out his chest. "You don't tell me what to do. Nobody does." He gestured vaguely at the bakery. "This is our neighborhood. We do what we want. We take what we want." Elias's expression did not change. He was not angry. He was not afraid. He was disappointed. It was the look of an engineer finding a fatal flaw in a design. It was the look of a craftsman seeing a beautiful piece of wood ruined by a clumsy hand. This was not a negotiation. It was a diagnostic. And the diagnosis was terminal. He simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible dip of his chin. It was not a gesture of agreement. It was an acceptance of the inevitable. A choice had been made. A structure was about to fail. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with the ozone smell of a coming storm. The morning rush was over, and a different kind of business was about to begin. The bell on the door chimed again, this time with a sharp, impatient authority. The man who entered was different from the other two. Where they were crude facsimiles of power, he was a more polished, if equally flawed, imitation. He was Rico. He wore a silk shirt, the top 3 buttons undone to display a thicket of gold chains and dark chest hair. His hair was slicked back with too much product, gleaming under the bakery's soft lights. He moved with a swagger that was meant to project confidence, but instead screamed insecurity. He was a lieutenant, a middle manager in the enterprise of fear, and he carried himself with the arrogance of a man who is always backed by someone stronger. He stopped just inside the door, his gaze taking in the scene with a flicker of annoyance. It was a tableau of suspended action. His 2 men, tense and uncertain. The old woman, a statue of fear. And the baker, a figure of unnerving calm behind his wooden fortress. What is this? Rico's voice was a high, nasal tenor that didn't match his thuggish CV. It was the voice of a man who had been bullied as a child, and now overcompensated with volume. Why is it taking so long? I ain't got all day. The scarred man visibly relaxed, his borrowed confidence flooding back now that his immediate superior was present. Just a little problem, boss. This baker here, he's got a mouth on him. Rico's eyes, small and predatory, settled on Elias for the first time. He looked him up and down, a slow, contemptuous appraisal. The flower on his apron, the simple, worn t-shirt, the hands resting on the counter. He saw nothing. A nobody. A ghost. A mouth on him? Rico laughed, a short, barking sound. He walked toward the counter, deliberately placing himself between his man and Elias. He was re-establishing the chain of command. He clapped the scarred man on the shoulder. Let me handle this. You go wait in the car. And take Knucklehead with you. He didn't even look at the younger thug. The 2 men, visibly relieved to be dismissed from a situation they no longer understood, shuffled out the door, the bell jangling their retreat. Now the room was quieter, the tension more focused. It was just Rico, Elias, and Mrs. Gable, who seemed to be trying to make herself invisible against the far wall. Rico leaned against the counter, affecting an air of casual command. He pulled a cigarette from his shirt pocket and placed it between his lips, but didn't light it. It was a prop. All right, baker man, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Playtime's over. I'm here for Mr. Silvestri's order. The name was dropped like a stone, intended to crush any further resistance. He was invoking the king to intimidate a pawn. Elias did not react to the name. He picked up the cloth he had set down earlier and began to slowly, methodically, wipe a clean section of the counter. The motion was hypnotic, infuriatingly calm. Rico watched, his jaw tightening. He was used to being the center of attention, the gravitational point of any room he entered. The baker's deliberate lack of engagement was a profound insult. Did you hear me? I said, I'm here for the bread. For Mr. Silvestri. He spoke the words slowly, as if to a child or a simpleton. Elias finished wiping the counter. He folded the cloth into a perfect square and placed it beside the sink. He looked at Rico. His eyes were clear, his expression unreadable. For the first time, he spoke more than 3 words. He gestured with his chin toward Mrs. Gable, who was still pressed against the wall, her gaze on the floor. Her son. Whatever he owes, I'll cover it. Rico stared at him, his mouth falling open slightly. The unlit cigarette drooped. He blinked as if he couldn't process the words. Then he burst out laughing. It was a loud, ugly, braying laugh that filled the small shop. He slapped the counter with his open palm. You? You'll cover it? He laughed again, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. With what? Sourdough starters? You got any idea who you're talking to? You got any idea how much money we're talking about? He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a hiss, the facade of amusement gone. Stick to your dough, baker. This is out of your league. Now get the bread. The dawn is waiting. This was the moment, the pivot point. Elias looked from Rico's smug, contemptuous face to Mrs. Gable's terrified one. He saw the tracks of a single tear tracing a path through the wrinkled landscape of her cheek. He thought of his father, a man who had built things meant to last, who had believed in clean lines and honest materials, and who had been destroyed by men like this. Men who built nothing, who only broke things. Men who used power not to create, but to crush. He felt the cold serpent in his gut uncoil, not with dread, but with a strange, clarifying fire. The vow of invisibility he had made was a shield, but a shield, he now realized, could also be a cage. He had been hiding not for survival, but out of fear. Fear of what he was capable of. Fear of becoming the kind of man who could meet this world's brutality with his own. He straightened to his full height. It was not a threatening gesture, but it subtly altered the dynamics of the room. He seemed taller, more solid. The flower on his apron seemed less like the mark of a humble trade and more like the dust of a battlefield. He met Rico's gaze, and for the first time, Rico saw something in the baker's eyes. A flicker of something ancient and unyielding. A bedrock integrity that his own shallow cruelty could not comprehend. Elias's voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a shard of glass. "I'm full up." Rico blinked. "Full up? What the hell does that mean?" "You got a standing order. You don't get to be full up." "It means," Elias clarified, his voice holding the dispassionate precision of a surgeon announcing a diagnosis, "that my capacity for today has been reached." He gestured to the empty shelves where the morning's pastries had been. "I have nothing left to sell." Rico's face, which had been pale, began to turn a mottled, blotchy red. He was being refused, publicly, in front of a witness, by a baker. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it was beyond his comprehension. It was a fundamental violation of the laws of his universe, where fear was gravity and he was a celestial body. "You're kidding me," he hissed, the cigarette falling from his lips and landing on the floor. "You are not refusing Mr. Silvestri. That's not a thing that happens." Elias simply looked at him. The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense, weighted. It was the silence of a vault door swinging shut. In that silence, Rico heard the unspoken truth. It was a thing that was happening. Right now. "He is not refusing Mr. Silvestri," Elias said, his voice calm. "He is refusing you." He turned his back on Rico and walked toward Mrs. Gable. He gently took her arm. "Come," he said softly. "Let's get you a cup of tea in the back." This final act of dismissal was the breaking point. It was one thing to be defied. It was another to be ignored, to be treated as an irrelevance. Rico's carefully constructed world of swagger and borrowed power crumbled into dust. All that was left was the raw, sputtering engine of his wounded pride. He was a caricature of a powerful man, and in the quiet dignity of the bakery, the caricature had been exposed. He stared at the baker's back, his hands balling into fists. The smell of yeast and sugar was gone, replaced by the sharp, coppery scent of imminent violence. The quiet monastery was about to become an arena. Rico let out a sound that was half roar, half strangled sob of pure fury. It was the sound of a man whose entire identity was built on a foundation of intimidation, and that foundation had just been reduced to rubble. He lunged. It was not a calculated attack. It was a clumsy, telegraphed rush, fueled by ego and rage. He aimed to grab Elias by the shoulder, to spin him around, to reassert his physical dominance through brute force. He was a man lunging at a shadow. Elias had not turned around, but he had felt the shift in the air, the compression of space behind him. His body knew before his mind did. He moved not away from the attack, but into it, a subtle pivot on the ball of his left foot. It was a movement of breathtaking economy. He did not seem to be moving quickly, yet suddenly he was no longer where Rico expected him to be. Rico's grasping hand found only empty air. His forward momentum, now unchecked, carried him past Elias and toward the counter. It was here that the baker's trap, laid by accident hours before, was sprung. Rico's expensive, smooth-soled leather shoe landed directly on the invisible slick of rye flour on the polished concrete. For a moment, physics became a form of poetry. Rico's feet went out from under him, as if yanked by an unseen wire. He pinwheeled his arms, his face a comical mask of shock and betrayal. He was a man who had spent his life on solid ground, and the ground had just turned to ice. His trajectory carried him face first into the solid oak front of the counter. The impact was not a sharp crack, but a wet, sickening thud. The sound of bone and cartilage meeting unyielding wood. Rico collapsed, slumping to the floor in a boneless heap, a gasp of pained surprise escaping his lips. A thin trickle of blood began to snake from his nose, a vivid crimson against the pale canvas of his skin. Elias had not touched him. He had simply used the environment, Rico's own momentum, and a bit of spilled flour to neutralize the threat. It was not a fight. It was an architectural solution to a problem of force. He turned, his face as calm and unreadable as before. He looked down at the man crumpled at his feet. He felt no satisfaction, no anger, no triumph. He felt only a vast, weary sadness. He had broken his exile. The ghost was out of the grave. He stepped over Rico's legs as one might step over a misplaced piece of furniture. He walked back to the front door and flipped the sign in the window from open to closed. Then he locked it. The click of the deadbolt was unnervingly loud in the sudden quiet. He turned to Mrs. Gable. She was pressed against the wall, her hands to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror and a dawning, disbelieving awe. She had seen the whole thing, a ballet of violence so swift and precise, it barely seemed real. "It's all right," Elias said, his voice gentle again, the calm returning as if it had never left. "He's not hurt badly, just his pride." He walked behind the counter, retrieved a clean, damp cloth from the sink, and knelt beside the groaning man on the floor. He didn't offer a hand up. He simply handed him the cloth. "You're bleeding on my floor," he said, his voice flat. Rico, dazed and humiliated, took the cloth. His hand trembled. He looked up at the baker, his eyes full of a new and unfamiliar emotion. Fear. The man he had dismissed as flower boy was something else entirely, something he did not understand. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. Elias stood up. He walked to the cooling rack where the single, perfect loaf of pane di Altamura sat, its dark crust gleaming. It was the physical manifestation of his contract with the world he had tried to leave and the world he had just been dragged back into. He picked it up. It felt heavy in his hands, dense with grain and time and consequence. He walked back to Rico, who was now struggling to sit up, holding the bloody cloth to his face. Elias held out the loaf. "This is for Mr. Silvestri's mother," he said. "Not for him, and not for you." He placed the loaf on the floor next to Rico, a careful distance from the spreading pool of blood. "Now get out of my bakery!" Rico stared at the bread, then at Elias. He scrambled to his feet, slipping again slightly on the flour, and staggered toward the door. He didn't look back. He fumbled with the lock, his hands shaking too much to work the simple mechanism. Elias walked over and unlocked it for him. Rico practically fell out onto the sidewalk and scurried away, a diminished, pathetic figure disappearing into the morning light. Elias locked the door again. The bakery was silent once more. The air was thick with the smell of bread, coffee, and the faint, metallic tang of blood. He looked at the mess on the floor, the spilled cigarette, the splotch of blood, the fine, disturbed dust of the flour. It was a mess he knew how to clean. But the other mess, the one he had just made of his quiet, ordered life, that was another matter entirely. The silence that followed Rico's humiliating retreat was profound. It was not the peaceful silence of the early morning, but a tense, ringing quiet, thick with unspoken questions. Mrs. Gable stood frozen, a fragile spectator to a drama she had unwillingly catalyzed. The bakery, once her refuge, had become a stage for a kind of power she did not comprehend. Elias moved as if waking from a dream. The explosive efficiency of the confrontation drained away, replaced by his usual deliberate calm. He was a man putting his tools away after a difficult job. He walked to the industrial sink in the back, the sound of running water filling the room, a sound of cleansing, of returning to normalcy. He washed his hands methodically, scrubbing under his nails, removing the phantom feeling of the conflict, if not its consequences. He dried his hands on a clean towel and turned to Mrs. Gable. Her face was pale, her body still trembling. He saw not a problem to be managed, but a person to be cared for. The hard lines on his face softened. The architect, the strategist, the hidden warrior receded, and the baker returned. "Tea," he said. It was not a question. He led her gently by the arm, his touch firm but reassuring, into the small room behind the main shop. It was his private space, a small office and kitchen area. It was as Spartan and immaculate as the bakery itself. A single wooden chair, a small table, a hot plate, and shelves lined not with ledgers, but with books on fermentation, grain varietals, and architectural history. He sat her down in the chair. He moved with quiet competence, filling a kettle, spooning loose-leaf chamomile into a small pot. The simple domestic ritual was a balm against the harshness of the preceding minutes. He was rebuilding the world that Rico had shattered, one small, kind action at a time. He did not speak. Silence, he knew, could be a sanctuary for those in shock. It demanded nothing. As the water heated, his mind worked. He had broken the first and most important rule of his self-imposed exile. Do not be seen. For 7 years he had cultivated invisibility. He had sanded down every sharp edge of his personality, every hint of his past, until he was smooth, unremarkable, easily overlooked. Today he had not only been seen, he had made a spectacle. He had challenged a known tributary of the Silvestri River, a force of nature in this city's underworld. Why? The question was not a surprise to him. He knew why. He had seen the reflection of a much larger, more sophisticated evil in Rico's petty cruelty. He had seen the same arrogance, the same assumption that the powerful have a right to consume the weak. It was the same force that had destroyed his father. His father, Marcus, had been an architect of principles. He built things, hospitals, libraries, public housing, that were meant to serve people. He believed in honest materials, in light, in air, in creating structures that elevated the human spirit. Then a corporate raider, a man named Sterling, had come along. Sterling built nothing. He was a creature of leverage and debt, a demolitions expert of the financial world. He had bought out Marcus's firm, gutted it for its real estate assets, and sold off the pieces, leaving a trail of broken projects and ruined careers. Marcus had fought him, had tried to expose his fraudulent dealings, and for his trouble, he had been systematically destroyed, his reputation smeared, his finances drained, his spirit broken. He had died of a heart attack a year later, a man consumed by a battle he couldn't win. Elias had been his father's right hand, the brilliant young prodigy set to inherit the firm. He had watched the entire demolition up close. The trauma of it had sent him into hiding, convinced that the only way to survive in a world run by Sterlings was to become so small, so insignificant, that they would never notice you. He had been wrong. The wolf doesn't care how small the sheep is. The kettle whistled, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through his reverie. He poured the steaming water over the chamomile flowers, the fragrant steam filling the small room. He brought the cup to Mrs. Gable. Her hands were still trembling, so he placed it on the table in front of her. "Thank you, Elias," she whispered. Her voice was stronger now. I've never seen anything like that." He simply nodded. There was nothing to say. He couldn't explain that his pivot on the flower was a principle of structural load distribution. He couldn't explain that his calm assessment of Rico was the same process he used to follow to find the stress fractures in a concrete pillar. He couldn't explain that he hadn't been fighting a man, but solving an equation of force and weakness. She looked at him, her old, clear eyes seeing more than he was comfortable with. "You are a good man, Elias. But you are not just a baker, are you?" It was the question he had dreaded for 7 years. It was the question that, once asked, could not be unanswered. He looked at the rows of books on his shelf. He looked at the worn photo of his father tacked to the wall, a smiling man in a hard hat standing before a half-finished bridge, a monument to connection and strength. "No," he said, his voice quiet. "I'm not." The admission hung in the air between them, a fragile new structure built in the wreckage of the morning. He had confessed. He had revealed a part of himself, and the world had not ended. He felt a strange lightness, the feeling of a man setting down a burden he didn't realize he was still carrying. He had acted. He had defended the weak. He had honored his father's true legacy, not by hiding, but by standing firm. The consequences would come. He knew that. Men like Silvestri did not tolerate disruptions in their ecosystem. But for the first time in a very long time, Elias felt he was ready to face them. He was no longer just a man in hiding. He was his father's son. The penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of the Blackwood Tower, a shard of obsidian glass that pierced the sky over the city's financial district. From this height, the city was an abstract map, a silent, sprawling circuit board of lights and movement. The world down below, with its noise and its dirt and its petty struggles, was a distant, theoretical concept. Here, there was only silence, glass, and the cold, clean air of immense power. Mr. Silvestri sat in a leather armchair that was the color of dried blood. He was not a large man, but he possessed a gravitational stillness that made the vast, minimalist room seem to revolve around him. He was dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit of charcoal gray, a white shirt, and no tie. His hands, clean and unadorned save for a simple gold wedding band from a marriage that had ended decades ago, rested on the arms of the chair. He was looking not at the spectacular view, but at a single, perfect white orchid on the marble table before him. He had been looking at it for 10 minutes. He was a man who understood systems. His empire was not built on crude violence and street-corner thuggery. That was a messy, inefficient business model he left to lesser men. His empire was built on information, on logistics, on understanding the intricate web of debts, loyalties, and obligations that held the city together. He was a master of supply chains, whether the commodity was concrete, pharmaceuticals, or political influence. His defining characteristic was not cruelty, but a profound and unsentimental understanding of cause and effect. He did not get angry. Anger was a wasteful emotion, a misallocation of resources. He got curious. His lawyer, a man named Marcus Heller, entered the room. Heller moved with the quiet deference of a man who knew he was in the presence of a far more dangerous predator. He was holding a tablet. "Sir," he said, his voice quiet, "we have a problem with the morning delivery." Silvestri did not turn. He continued to contemplate the orchid, its waxy, alien perfection. "Define the problem," he said. His voice was a low, calm baritone, a voice accustomed to being obeyed without having to be raised. The package was refused. Heller paused, allowing the outrageousness of the statement to land. Silvestri's silence was an invitation to continue. Rico went to the bakery for the item. There was an altercation. He was denied the product and, it seems, physically ejected from the premises. Silvestri's head tilted a fraction of an inch. Ejected. By whom? By the baker. For the first time, Silvestri shifted his gaze from the orchid to his lawyer. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and deeply patient. They were the eyes of a man who has seen everything and is surprised by nothing. And yet, for a fleeting moment, a flicker of something, not surprise but interest, danced in their depths. "The baker," he repeated. The word sounded strange in this clean, sterile air. It was a word from a different world, a world of earth and grain and honest labor. Heller nodded. He tapped the screen of his tablet. "His name is Elias. He runs the place himself. According to Rico, who is not entirely coherent at the moment, The baker took exception to his collection methods regarding another matter: an old woman, a small debt. So the baker intervened on behalf of an old woman. Silvestri's face was unreadable. He was processing the information, fitting it into the vast, complex mosaic of his world. A piece that did not fit, an anomaly, and he ejected Rico, a man with 2 of his own men present initially. Silvestri steepled his fingers. His mind was not on the insult to his authority. It was on the mechanics of the event. The how. Rico was an idiot, a strutting peacock, but he was a physically imposing idiot. The men he chose were the same. For a baker, a single man, to overwhelm 3 of them was not just an anomaly. It was a statistical improbability, and Silvestri did not believe in statistical improbabilities. He believed in hidden variables. What is Rico's status? Heller grimaced slightly. A broken nose. A great deal of bruising to his ego. He is claiming he slipped. He did, Silvestri said. It was not a question. Men like Rico did not admit to being defeated by a baker. They would invent any excuse to save face. But the fact remained. The system had been disrupted. The delivery had failed. And the bread? Silvestri asked, his voice softening slightly. This was the true heart of the matter. Rico claims the baker gave it to him after the altercation. He left it at the front desk downstairs. Silvestri was silent for a long moment. He looked back at the orchid. A perfect, beautiful thing, grown in a controlled environment. But it had no scent, no substance. It was pure form. The bread from the bakery was the opposite. It was rustic, imperfect on the surface, but it was real. It had substance. It was the only food his mother, wasting away in the suite of rooms next door, would eat. The only thing that seemed to tether her fading appetite to the world. The baker did not know it, but his daily labor was a critical part of a much more important system: the preservation of the one person in the world Silvestri truly loved. Find out about the baker, Silvestri said, his voice regaining its usual cool command. Not a street-level inquiry. I don't want him intimidated. I don't want him touched. I want to know who he is. I want his history. I want to know where a man who runs a small bakery learned to dismantle 3 of my men without, I suspect, breaking a sweat. Use the resources from the Sterling file. I want it on my desk by tonight. Heller nodded. Yes, sir. And what about the standing order? The standing order, Silvestri said, a slow, thin smile touching his lips for the first time, is now a matter of personal interest. It seems I will have to pick up the bread myself tomorrow. I have a feeling I need to meet this baker. A man of principle is a rare commodity. I want to see what he's made of. Heller left the room. Silvestri remained, looking out over the city. A baker. An old woman. A loaf of bread. It was a small, simple story from the world down below, but it contained elements that fascinated him. Courage, integrity, and an unexpected application of force. Most men in his position would see an insult to be punished. Silvestri, a true connoisseur of power, saw a resource to be understood, and perhaps acquired. The baker had made a very powerful enemy, but he might also have made a very powerful ally. The outcome was not yet written, and for the first time in a long time, Mr. Silvestri was not sure how the story would end. He found the feeling refreshing. The file that landed on Mr. Silvestri's desk that evening was not thick. It was a slim, elegant portfolio, the kind used for architectural renderings. The irony was not lost on Heller, who had compiled it with the meticulous care of a man whose life depended on his thoroughness. Silvestri did not open it immediately. He poured 2 glasses of a deep, dark red wine, a Barolo from a year that was both rare and significant to him. He swirled the wine in his glass, watching the legs cling to the crystal. A slow, viscous ballet. He was a man who savored process. He had already visited his mother. He had sat by her bed, the scent of lavender and old age filling the room. He had held her frail, paper-thin hand and watched her sleep. The loaf of bread, the pane di Altamura, sat on her bedside table, untouched. When the nurse had tried to offer her a slice, she had refused. "It's not right," she had whispered, her voice a faint rustle of leaves. He didn't make it with a good heart today. Silvestri, a man who moved millions of dollars with a single phone call, who could make governors tremble, had no answer to this. His mother's simple, peasant intuition had detected the violence and anger that had been baked into the bread's journey. It was tainted, useless. This, more than any insult to his authority, was the baker's true transgression. He had disrupted a ritual that was sacred. Now, in the silent dark of his penthouse, with the city lights glittering like a carpet of fallen stars below, he finally opened the file. The first page was a photograph. A young man, no more than 25, with the same calm, serious eyes Silvestri's men had described. But in the photo, he was not wearing a flour-dusted apron. He was wearing a tailored suit and a hard hat, standing beside an older man who was clearly his father. They were on a construction site, a magnificent, soaring bridge arching in the background. The young man's name was Elias Vance. Silvestri read on. Elias Vance, son of the celebrated architect Marcus Vance, a prodigy. Graduated top of his class from the country's most prestigious school of architecture. His thesis, Structural Integrity as a Moral Principle, had won the coveted Raskind Prize. He was the heir apparent to Vance & Associates, a firm known for its ethical, visionary public works. Then the timeline darkened. Silvestri took a slow sip of wine. He knew this part of the story, or at least its broad strokes. The entry of Sterling, the corporate raider. He had crossed paths with Sterling before. Sterling was a termite, a creature that hollowed out strong, beautiful things from the inside, leaving a fragile shell that would collapse at the slightest pressure. The file detailed the hostile takeover, the asset stripping, the public smearing of Marcus Vance. It was a brutal, textbook demolition. The last entry in Elias Vance's public life was a court transcript. Elias, young and full of righteous fury, had tried to sue Sterling. He had presented evidence of fraud, of shell corporations, of cooked books. But Sterling's lawyers were brilliant, ruthless, and they had turned Elias's own passion against him, painting him as an unstable, grieving son lashing out. They had buried him in motions, in legal fees, in procedural darkness. Elias had lost. His father had died. And then Elias Vance had simply disappeared. He had vanished from public record. His credit cards went unused. His professional licenses lapsed. He became a ghost. Until 7 years ago. A man named Elias, no last name given, had paid cash for a derelict bakery on 3rd Street. He had rebuilt it from the ground up with his own hands. He had lived a quiet, monastic life ever since. Silvestri closed the file. He understood now. The baker was not a baker. He was a king in exile, a man of immense talent and principle who had been so profoundly wounded by the world that he had chosen to retreat from it entirely. The quiet bakery was not a business. It was a fortress. The disciplined routine was not a job. It was a form of meditation, a way to keep the ghosts at bay, and the confrontation with Rico. It was not a random act of defiance. It was the reemergence of a deeply buried moral code. Elias Vance had seen in Rico's petty extortion a microcosm of the same corrupt power that had destroyed his father. He had seen Sterling's face on Rico's sneering features, and he had acted, not as a baker, but as the man he was always meant to be, a defender of structural integrity, whether in a bridge or in a society. Silvestri looked at the name on the file. Sterling. The man was a nuisance. He was currently trying to muscle in on a Docklands redevelopment project that Silvestri had been carefully cultivating for years. Sterling used lawyers and politicians as his weapons. Silvestri preferred a more direct approach, but Sterling was slippery, insulated by layers of corporate and legal protection. He was a difficult man to get to. A plan began to form in Silvestri's mind. It was an elegant, symmetrical plan, the kind of plan an architect would appreciate. He saw the convergence of two separate trajectories, his problem with Sterling and his newfound interest in the baker. What if one problem could be the solution to the other? Elias Vance was a man who understood systems. He understood how to build them, and therefore he understood how to dismantle them. He had failed to beat Sterling in the courtroom, with the law as his weapon. But what if he were given different weapons? What if he were given access to Silvestri's resources, to his network of information, to his ability to apply pressure in the places where the law could not reach? It was a risk. Elias was a man of principle. He might refuse. He might see Silvestri as no different from Sterling. But Silvestri suspected otherwise. He had seen the file. He had heard the story from Rico. Elias was not a pacifist. He was a man of controlled, precise force. He did not break things randomly. He disassembled them. And Silvestri had a very complex, very corrupt structure that he wanted disassembled. He picked up his phone. He did not need to look up the number. Heller answered on the first ring. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "No one with me. Clear my schedule for the day." "Yes, sir," Heller replied. Silvestri hung up. He looked out at the city again. He was about to descend from his glass tower, to walk into the small, fragrant world of a man who had tried to hide from his own greatness. It was a recruitment visit. He was not going to make a threat. He was not going to make a demand. He was going to make an offer of a partnership, an offer of a perfectly designed, beautifully executed revenge. And he was going to bring his own bread, because something told him he would need to make a gesture of good faith. He would have to prove that he, unlike the bread from today, did not have a bad heart. It was a challenge, and Mr. Silvestri loved a challenge. The next morning, the bell above the bakery door chimed at precisely 8 o'clock. It was a single, deliberate chime. Elias looked up from the counter he was wiping. He had not slept. He had spent the night baking, not out of necessity, but out of a need to control something, to feel the familiar comfort of process. The bakery was filled with an almost overwhelming amount of bread. It lined every shelf, every available surface. It was a fortress of carbohydrates. The man who stood in the doorway was alone. He was older, in his late 60s, with a mane of silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from some hard, elegant stone. He wore a dark cashmere overcoat that hung from his shoulders with an easy grace. He held no phone. He wore no jewelry except for a simple gold ring. His stillness was what struck Elias most. He did not look around the shop. He simply looked at Elias, his dark eyes assessing, intelligent, and unnervingly calm. Elias knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic, that this was Mr. Silvestri. The air in the shop, which moments before had been warm and filled with the scent of yeast, suddenly felt cold and thin. Mrs. Gable was not here today. No one was. It was just the two of them, the king of the city's shadows and the king in exile. Mr. Silvestri took a step inside, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the scrubbed floor. He was holding a small, simple paper bag. He placed it on the counter between them. "A peace offering," he said. His voice was a low baritone, calm and without any hint of menace. "I believe my employee caused a disruption yesterday. I apologize for his lack of professionalism." Elias looked at the bag, then back at the man. He did not acknowledge the apology. He said nothing. Silence was a language he was fluent in, and he knew this man was too. Silvestri did not seem perturbed by the silence. He looked around the bakery, his gaze finally taking in the space. His eyes didn't just see. They analyzed. He noted the clean lines, the efficient layout, the way the morning light from the large front window was used to illuminate the workspace. You have a good eye for structure, he observed. The comment was so unexpected, so specific that it momentarily threw Elias off balance. It's a bakery, Elias said, his voice flat. It's a well-designed space, Silvestri corrected gently. Form following function. No wasted material, no wasted movement. It reminds me of the work of Marcus Vance. The name spoken aloud in this place was like a physical blow. Elias felt the floor shift beneath his feet. The carefully constructed walls of his sanctuary trembled. He gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles turning white. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "I am a man whose mother is very fond of your bread," Silvestri replied, his gaze unwavering. "She says you bake with a good heart. She also says that yesterday's loaf was tainted. She wouldn't eat it." The statement was a masterful move. It was not a threat. It was an expression of vulnerability, a confession. It reframed the entire conflict, moving it from a matter of business and violence to one of family and care. It was a bridge offered across the chasm of their two worlds. Elias looked at this man, this feared and powerful figure, and saw not a crime boss, but a son, worried about his mother. The anger in him subsided, replaced by a weary recognition. "Why are you here?" Elias asked, his voice losing some of its edge. Silvestri leaned forward slightly. "Because I read your file, Elias Vance. Because I know who you are. And because I have a problem that I believe a man with your particular talents could help me solve." He paused, letting the words sink in. He was laying his cards on the table. "I know about Sterling," he continued. "I know what he did to your father. I know he is a cancer, a man who destroys everything he touches. And right now, he is trying to destroy a project of mine." Elias laughed, a short, bitter, humorless sound. "And you want me to what? Bake him a poisoned loaf?" "No," Silvestri said, his expression serious. "I want you to do what you do best. I want you to analyze a structure, a corrupt, bloated, fraudulent structure. I want you to find its weaknesses, its stress points, its load-bearing lies, and then I want you to help me bring the whole thing down. I have the demolition crew. I need the architect." It was an insane proposal. A mafia boss offering a baker a job as a corporate saboteur. But in the strange, suspended reality of the bakery that morning, it made a perverse kind of sense. It was the convergence of two lives, two quests. Silvestri's for power and Elias's for a justice he had long since given up on. "Why me?" Elias asked. "You have lawyers, accountants." "I have hammers," Silvestri said. "You are a scalpel. Sterling beat you in the courtroom because you were playing his game by his rules. I am inviting you to play a different game. My game, with my rules." He pushed the paper bag slightly closer to Elias. Inside, Elias could see the corner of a file, the same distinctive blue as the ones his father used to use. And on top of it, a single, perfect loaf of bread, not from a rival bakery, but a simple, honest loaf of supermarket white bread. The gesture was so humble, so absurd, it was almost touching. "Think of it as a commission," Silvestri said. "Not for a building of steel and glass, but for a demolition. A chance to finish what your father started. A chance to prove that good design and a strong foundation will always, in the end, defeat the rot." He straightened up. "My number is in the file. Call me when you've made a decision." He turned and walked out of the bakery, the bell chiming his departure. Elias was left alone in the silence, the smell of bread mingling with the faint, expensive scent of Silvestri's cologne. He looked at the bag on the counter. He looked at the mountains of bread he had baked in his sleepless night, a frantic attempt to reinforce the walls of his fortress. But the fortress had been breached. The world had come in, and it had offered him not a threat, but a choice. Hide or build, or perhaps unbuild. He reached out and touched the file. It felt like a blueprint. It felt like destiny. For 2 days, Elias did not open the file. He let it sit on the counter, a silent, rectangular challenge. He went through the motions of his life. He baked. He cleaned. He sold bread to his regulars, who noticed a new tension in him, a coiled stillness that had replaced his usual placid neutrality. He was a man standing on the edge of a precipice, and the whole neighborhood could feel the vibration. He was at war with himself. One part of him, the part that had built this quiet life, screamed at him to burn the file, to reinforce the walls, to disappear even deeper into his anonymity. It was the voice of survival, the voice of trauma. It promised safety, peace, the simple, rhythmic comfort of the dough in his hands. But another part of him, a part he had thought long dead, was stirring. It was his father's voice. It was the voice of the architect, the builder, the man who believed in a world that was just and well-ordered. This voice spoke of responsibility. It spoke of the duty of the strong to protect the weak. It whispered that hiding was not living, that safety bought at the price of one's soul was no safety at all. What is a man but a structure built of choices? On the third morning, he found his answer not in logic, but in bread. He was shaping a batch of sourdough, the dough cool and alive beneath his hands. It was a familiar, comforting process. But as he worked, he realized he was doing it automatically, his mind 1,000 miles away. He was thinking about Sterling's corporate structure, imagining it as a flawed building. He saw the over-leveraged debt as a crumbling foundation. He saw the shell corporations as hollow, non-load-bearing walls. He saw the interlocking board of directors as a series of weak, rusted joints. He was already disassembling it in his head. He was already designing its demolition. He stopped, his hands covered in flour. He looked at the dough. He had spent 7 years perfecting this craft, this art of creation. But what Silvestri was offering was also a form of creation. It was the creation of justice. The creation of a space where men like his father could build without fear of men like Sterling. It was a demolition in the service of future construction. He washed his hands, dried them, and walked to the counter. He opened the file. It was not a dossier of criminal intelligence. It was an architectural plan. Silvestri, with a brilliant and insightful flair, had had his people map out Sterling's entire corporate empire as a building. Each company was a room, each financial connection a hallway, each legal firewall a door. It was a labyrinth, a monstrosity of poor design and moral compromise, but it was a structure, and any structure could be brought down if you knew where to apply the pressure. Tucked inside was a single sheet of paper with a phone number, and beneath it a handwritten note. It was not in Silvestri's hand. The script was shaky, feminine, and old. It said simply, "A good man builds. A great man builds a better world. My son tells me you are a great man. Elena Silvestri." It was his mother. It was the final, perfectly placed piece of the puzzle. This wasn't just about business or revenge for Silvestri. It was about honor. It was about his mother's belief in him, and her belief in the world. Elias picked up his phone. He dialed the number. It was answered on the first ring. Silvestri's voice was calm. "I was expecting your call." "I'm in," Elias said, "but on my terms." "Of course," Silvestri replied. "I would expect nothing less. This isn't for you. It's for him. For my father. And it's not about revenge. It's about balance. We are not destroying a man. We are correcting a structural flaw." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Silvestri spoke, and his voice held a note of something that sounded almost like reverence. "As you wish, architect. When do you want to start?" Elias looked around his bakery, at the warm ovens, the sacks of flour, the cooling racks. It had been his sanctuary, his hiding place. Now it was his headquarters. "I've already started," he said, and hung up. A month later, Elias stood not in his bakery, but in the penthouse of the Blackwood Tower. He was not wearing an apron, but a simple, well-fitting dark suit that did not conceal the quiet strength of his frame. He was leaning over a massive glass table, and spread across it were not loaves of bread, but blueprints. The blueprints of Sterling's empire. Silvestri stood beside him, watching. He had barely said a word, content to observe the master at work. Elias had spent the last month in a fever of creation. He had worked with Silvestri's accountants, lawyers, and informants, absorbing vast amounts of data. He had been a whirlwind of quiet, intense focus, cross-referencing, connecting dots, building a model of Sterling's world. And now, he was ready. He pointed with a long, steady finger to a small, seemingly insignificant holding company in a foreign country. A single, weak support beam in the basement of the entire structure. Here, he said. This is the point of failure. It's a ghost corporation, but it holds the debt for 3 of his major U.S. assets. The paperwork is fraudulent. I found the original transfer documents. They're forged. Silvestri's lawyer, Heller, who was also in the room, peered at the documents Elias had highlighted. He looked stunned. We've had 3 forensic accounting teams look at this. They found nothing. They were looking for a crime, Elias said simply. I was looking for a design flaw. The forger made a mistake. He used a font that wasn't invented until 6 months after the document was supposedly signed. The simplicity of it was breathtaking. It was the architectural equivalent of a hairline crack in a dam. If we expose this, Elias continued, his voice calm and precise, it triggers a default clause in his primary line of credit. The whole house of cards comes down. Not with a bang, with the stroke of a pen. Silvestri looked at Elias, a slow smile of profound appreciation spreading across his face. It was beautiful. It was elegant. It was a work of art. What do you need? Silvestri asked. A messenger, Elias replied. Someone to deliver the proof to the right regulatory body. Someone Sterling can't buy or intimidate. Silvestri nodded. He already had someone in mind. The end came quickly. A quiet news story on the financial pages, an investigation, a freeze on assets, a cascade of failures. Sterling, the great white shark, was beached. He wasn't arrested. He wasn't shot in the street. He was simply ruined, rendered irrelevant. His power, which had seemed so absolute, was revealed to be a fragile illusion. 1 week later, Elias was back in his bakery. It was 4 a.m. The air was cool. The ovens were humming. He was shaping dough. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The bell on the door chimed. It was Silvestri. He was holding 2 glasses and a bottle of the same expensive Barolo. He set them on the counter. To a well-executed design, he said, pouring the wine. Elias looked at him. He didn't reach for the glass. It's done, he said. My father's name is cleared. The foundation he built is secure again. Silvestri raised his glass. To Marcus Vance. He took a sip. And what about you, Elias? Your work is not done. There are many flawed structures in this city. I could use an architect. Elias shook his head slowly. He picked up a piece of dough, feeling its familiar weight, its living potential. I'm not an architect of demolitions, he said. I'm a builder. He gestured around the bakery. This is what I build. It's small. It's simple. But it's honest. And it feeds people. Silvestri looked at him, and for the first time he seemed to understand. He had thought he was recruiting a weapon. He had found something far more rare, a man who knew his own purpose. He set his glass down. He understood that this was not a refusal, but a declaration of identity. Elias Vance would not be his lieutenant. He would remain a king, but in his own, small, fragrant kingdom. Very well, Baker, Silvestri said, a note of genuine respect in his voice. He turned to leave. At the door, he paused. The standing order. I assume it is reinstated? Elias nodded, a small smile touching his lips. 9 o'clock. as always, for your mother." Silvestri nodded back. He left, and the bakery was quiet again. Elias looked down at the dough in his hands. He punched it down, folded it, and began to shape it into a familiar, rustic sphere. He was not a weapon. He was not a corporate raider or a kingpin. He was a man who made bread. He had faced the darkness of his past, not by running from it, but by facing it on his own terms, with his own skills. He had not destroyed the monster to become one himself. He had simply reminded the world that some things are not for sale, that some structures are built not of glass and steel, but of integrity, and that true power isn't about how much you can take, but about what you are willing to build.